You are listening to 95.7 FM WELT, Fort Wayne, Radioactive. The opinions and views expressed in this show are those of the hosts and guests only. They do not represent those of FreeThought Fort Wayne, WELT, or any other organization. Welcome to the Hoosier Humanist Hour, where we explore science, religion, culture, ethics, and community from the humanist perspective. Join us as we discuss those topics and more, free from the ideologies of religion and superstition.
Welcome to the Hoosier Humanist Hour. Thank you for joining us once again. If you haven't heard us before, we are members of FreeThought Fort Wayne, and we come together and we do this radio show. We basically talk about topics from a secular perspective outside of superstition and religion. That's our main goal, but our topics vary widely. If you're interested about continuing the conversation or kind of like having these types of conversations, look us up, FreeThought Fort Wayne. You can email us, or our website is freethoughtfw.org, or you can email at fortwayneaha@gmail.com. So anyway, interesting show tonight. We're going to be doing cognitive biases again, and this will be part 2 of cognitive bias. We had a good time doing it the first time. We thought we would do it again. Cognitive bias. Well, let's do a refresher on what this is. First, my name is D. I'm here with V and Caleb and our technical supervisor, Andrew. Welcome, guys. How are you?
Doing fantastic.
Wonderful. Great. Are we ready? This is take 2, actually, on cognitive bias, part 2, take 2, because we got almost all the way through our first recording, and then we lost to the recording. So hopefully we sound excited about the topic still.
I'm excited. I think it's
cognitive bias, guys.
Yeah.
It is. It's terribly interesting. So if you've never heard of a cognitive bias, here is the Wikipedia quick definition. A cognitive bias refers to the systematic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality in judgment, whereby inferences about other people and situations may be drawn in an illogical fashion. Individuals create their own subjective social reality from their perception of the input. So I think that definition is hard to understand for the layman just getting introduced to it. But
it's like living in your own.
Anybody want to give me a more layman?
Yeah, I honestly, like you were saying, it's essentially it's like everybody's own subjective bubble of reality and how they perceive it.
That's a hard concept. Go ahead, V.
Oh, I was going to say, I would call it just brain failings. You're basically concluding things that are not rational. If you were to, let's look at it from, I'm an engineer, I like to make decisions based on, formulas and tables and things like that. And with concrete criteria for how to reach a decision. And basically, if I was to use that more engineering method, it would be different from the method that I would, without that. The natural method by which we make these decisions is to take shortcuts. We're used to doing things one way. We continue to do them that way. All kinds of, it's a cognitive bias. So it's just failures to make the logical choice or the logical conclusion.
And these failures come from different angles too. Part of it is our culture, our environment that influence us to think these way, and part of it is just our genetic makeup. We're wired in certain ways to think this way. So see if this is a really good example, like right off the bat, like when you listen to music from the Middle East, it's very different, right?
Right.
It's really hard to explain if you haven't heard it before, but it sounds really funny to me. It's like, how in the world can anybody like this music? It's ridiculous. Because I'm used to music here in this particular culture, and it sounds a lot different. So that would be an example of a simple bias, would it not?
Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
Yeah, because essentially what's happening is they're being conditioned culturally to appreciate certain tones that we don't. In most westernized culture, you're going to find that the chords or the key structure is set up such that it goes from C, C sharp, D, and on, set up like a piano keyboard. Over in those countries, in like India, I believe, they use tones that are between C and C sharp. So they have a much more specific palette than we do.
That's interesting.
Yeah, let me give you another example just to stick with music. Where I'm from, in music you have these rhythms, and they describe how many notes of what length creates the pattern of the music. And in most Western culture, it's more even type of rhythm, where in some songs where I'm from, it's uneven. To the point where I was talking to a friend of mine that has a music degree from Northwestern, and so I mean, this guy is really smart. And I asked him to try to catch the rhythm of a song that I played for him. So basically, just to tap it out with his hand, just like you would hear the drums and you can tap the drums with your hands. Fairly easy on most songs, but he couldn't catch the rhythm of this thing because it was uneven. It wasn't the rhythm that he was used to, and I believe to some Westerners, that kind of music would sound very, like almost like a cacophony a little bit. It's not even good music at all. You wouldn't consider it, but to me or to people from, Eastern Europe and some of those regions that use those kind of uneven rhythms, that's just music, and it sounds just fine.
You're just totally jamming to that stuff over there, right?
Yeah.
Just
there's dances with steps that you do, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's.
Are you saying that there's no consistent rhythm in these things, or that Westerners aren't usually capable of interpreting this rhythm?
Well, there is a consistent rhythm, yes, but it repeats in a different way.
Okay.
It's not. It's like the normal rhythm that you would hear is something like 3/4 or 4/4 or stuff like that. This thing is measured in 7/8. So the rhythm it's still a repeatable rhythm, but it's a different kind of length that is repeated.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So it's just it sounds weird when you to an ear that's not used to it.
And honestly.
Go ahead, Caleb.
I was just saying, honestly, the only music that I've ever heard that I couldn't imagine being awesome, personally, for me, I just can't imagine anyone loving this, or how they could, is that African horn thing that just like that thing. I mean, there are probably whole sets of like hour-long pieces composed over the millennia, and I honestly don't think I could tolerate a single one of them.
You know what I would love to know? Like, what's the equivalent of like Indiana's John Mellencamp in the weird horn thing that you're talking? Woo, woo, woo. Is there like a the old standby songs that people listen to for decades on the radio of what's the instrument called, Caleb?
I wish I knew. I know that I've heard the name of this several times. I can't think of it right off the top of my head.
It's like the Crocodile Dundee horn that you hear.
Yeah.
Right?
That's exactly
called a
what it is.
didgeridoo.
Yeah. A didgeridoo.
Didgeridoo. That's what it is. Thank you, Andrew.
So yeah, I always wonder if there's like an equivalent in one culture's music to another culture's music. And I would love to hear, if there's any way to quantify it, I would love to hear like the John Mellencamp of Syria or something, and see what that song sounds like or what that artist sounds like.
Well, I can send you some music from my home country that you will be amazed.
Yeah, but what kind of music are you sending me? Is it like what country are you from?
Bulgaria.
Would it be like, how would I know the difference between Bulgarian like heavy metal and Bulgarian elevator music?
Well, but that's the thing though. The heavy metal is going to be the heavy metal, but the traditional music and it doesn't have to be Bulgarian, but even if it's like traditional Greek or anything from that region, is if you haven't heard it before, it's gonna sound so different to you. Like even the words when they sing them are so drawn out that you can. I even as a native speaker have a hard time understanding what they're saying just because the words are just so drawn out that once you know what it is, you've read it or you've heard it a few times and you figured it out, then you know it. Okay, it's good. But when you're hearing a song for the first time, even to a native, it may be even hard to understand the words, and you wouldn't even be able to tell where a word begins and ends. I guarantee you that.
I have a question. And it's probably going to put on display for you guys some of my own cognitive biases. But what you're describing, is this the kind of music that you might hear playing in the background in a movie like Braveheart, the Bulgarian music? I don't know. For some reason, I'm kind of making this connection for some reason.
Well, actually, the movie 300, did you guys ever see that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So the last song there, in the movie, it's actually a Macedonian song, which is, very similar. And, it would be that type of music. It's not something, if you ever watch the movie, or you can find it on YouTube and stuff very easily if you just go to, look up 300 Final Song or something like that. I'm sure.
Can't play it on the radio, can we, right?
No, I don't think so.
Can somebody hum it for me, please?
but that's the bias, I find that thing to be very, very beautiful, and even if you listen for it, I guarantee you're not going to be able to tell where the words begin and end in that song in many cases.
I think I'm gonna stick with John Mellencamp for a while.
Yeah, no, go for it. You wanted an example, I'm giving you one that's famous.
Well,
that's pretty awesome.
Well, there's actually a cognitive bias that I think you're describing. This one's called the mere exposure effect. This is a tendency to express undue liking for things merely because of a familiarity that you have with them. Mm-hmm. So I think that this might kind of play into it, something along these lines. Excuse me. Just to kind of transition back to the topic here. Sure. The mere exposure effect actually might help also to explain how people could, for example, switch from one type of church to a completely different type of church. As long as there are certain similarities, they can kind of resolve that with this mere exposure effect. In fact, something like this might have even helped to facilitate and even perpetuate my beliefs in like ghosts back when I was spiritual. The supernatural and the afterlife in particular were concepts that were near and dear to me for years. And it was very difficult for me to give those up. I was giving them undue liking because of the familiarity that I had with them. Hence the mere exposure effect.
Yeah, I think when you grow up with stuff, that also relates to, some foods that you may grow up with, that you've been exposed to and that
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. Well, I think it's, speaking to our audience who may not be exposed to the idea of bias at all, just to understand what bias is can be really, really powerful. And what you guys are talking about, like liking food, or what did you just mention, Caleb?
I'm sorry?
What did you just mention?
Oh, I was mentioning like how it might have helped perpetuate certain beliefs for me and others.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, just things that you like are biases in a certain sense. So, that's me trying to speak to our audience who may have never heard of bias or what it means.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to try to keep my initial definition pretty short and sweet. Because, like you were saying, it's essentially the things that we like. So it's like living in our own little subjective bubble.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. Okay, I've got one. I thought this was interesting. This is The Curse of Knowledge. That's the title of it.
Yeah.
When better informed people find it extremely difficult to think about problems from the perspective of lesser informed people. I think it's what this reminds me of is it's a really good idea to understand what the opposing point of view is in any opinion that you hold. Like, understand where they come from, and hopefully you can get to the point where you feel like they're lesser informed. But a lot of times they just have a view of the world that leads them to a particular opinion. But you can have this curse of knowledge too, which kind of makes you feel like you're superior to people. But anyway, that's my
I know
thought.
exactly what you mean, though, because like I find it extremely difficult myself to understand how anyone could truly believe in, like, say, six-day creation, for example, especially given all the evidence to the contrary. And my sister, she's a creationist, and she's a six-day creationist, young earther. And I find it extremely difficult to try to put myself in her shoes, because we love having, you know, these long talks about the things you never talk about when you're drinking. And I have a really hard time leveling with her on these particular issues, mostly because I can't find a way to approach the subject aside from using lately, I take that back. Lately, I've been using the Socratic method. I highly suggest anyone who has never heard of such a thing to look into something called street epistemology to help with problems like that. It's a very useful tool to help to help building bridges with theists in particular, or pretty much anybody about anything. But there you go. Anyway, but yeah, so the curse of knowledge, I feel personally, I honestly have this when I'm talking to my sister about these things.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, the funny thing is...
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, the funny thing with the curse of knowledge is that when you have two opposing points of view, like let's say you're an evolutionary perspective guy, you obviously think you're a better informed person, right? Well, your sister also has the same bias going on, thinking that she is a better informed person based upon her sources. So I just think it's interesting how two people in an argument can have the exact same bias and cannot find common ground because of it.
But I think part of that bias, though, assuming that the person you're talking to has knowledge that you have?
Well, I think that the curse of knowledge is simply a heuristic that could potentially lead to fallacious reasoning. So everyone can have their own subjective, quote, curse of knowledge, and that's how it qualifies as a cognitive bias.
Yeah, because imagine what that does. For example, on the world stage, when superpowers meet to discuss things, but sometimes these superpowers may come from very different cultures, and they think they know things, and they make assumptions based on that. Like, for example, imagine the U.S. president meeting the Chinese president. The systems that these people come from, their knowledge that they have of how an economy runs, like all this stuff is so different. So imagine how difficult it would be to overcome these barriers and this type of thinking when they're trying to negotiate over trade deals, over military, and how to maybe prevent pirates from taking ships in the middle of the ocean, or sharing secrets they know in order to catch international criminals. All that kind of stuff. That is highly, highly affected by this very bias that you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sure. This kind of brings into light another type of bias, which is, since we're talking about, the political spectrum here, there's one called the framing effect. And this one's a little bit complicated. I'll do my best to keep it simple. And basically, the framing effect is a type of cognitive bias where people will react to a particular choice in different ways depending on how it's presented.
Right.
For example, if it's presented as a loss versus a gain. So if the thing here is that people tend to avoid risk when a positive frame is presented, but seek risk when a negative frame is presented. So, for example, this one's kind of tough. I'm sorry, bear with me. If let's just say if there were 300 lives in danger, and we were given options A or B. If A is phrased in a positive, such as being the option that will save 100 people, and let's let this idea include that there's also a 1 in 3 chance that all 300 will survive, while there's a 2 out of 3 chance that none will survive. Okay, so again, there's 300 lives in danger, and if we go with option A, we're likely to save 100 lives, but there's a chance that we could lose them all or save them all. Option B, if we phrase this in a negative way, if we say that 200 people will die, also include the idea that there's a 1 in 3 chance that none will die, while there's a 2 out of 3 chance that all will die. Most people are far more likely to agree with option A, and they're far more likely to be more agreeable to option A. And this is the type of thing that is, I bring this up because this is the type of bias that is used when the media wants to try to put a spin on a particular topic. And you can spin it in either direction. And this is also something that politicians use to put a spin on any particular topic and to turn it into a positive or a negative. You can get people to think that whatever you're against is horrible by phrasing it a certain way, or at least you're more likely to get them to, and vice versa.
You can totally see that when you look at, in politics, when you look at news sources that have a totally different bias. Like if one's bias is more liberal and the other's is more conservative, you could see the exact same story, the exact same headline about the same story, and they just seem totally different.
Yeah.
You're not even sure if it's the same thing that they're reporting on.
To me, that sounds a little bit like a glass half full, glass half empty type of thing. You know, that metaphor is generally used for optimists and pessimists, but it's also about how you present, information.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it, too. I love that. I honestly wish I'd heard this analogy before I explained all that stuff, because that's the easiest way I can think of to kind of rationalize this easily. Because, I mean, this is a very powerful tool. They've actually done studies on this heavily over the years. And so, for example, given a very similar example that I gave, option A was chosen by 72% of the participants when presented with a positive framing. So that number actually only drops by 22%, or I'm sorry, that number drops dramatically by 22% when the same choice was presented in a negative framing. So the number drops significantly just depending on how you present the information. And this is an extremely powerful tool, and it's something. This is one of those things that adds fuel to the fire for all those conspiracy theorists who think the government's trying to control everybody.
Are they not? Come on.
Yeah,
they are. Yeah, in that sense, they're very real. It's very real. They really are.
Well, I mean, it's hard to when you get a grip of that type of understanding of what's going on. It's like, well, how far can they push you? How far, if you're unaware of the bias, like how many of your opinions have been shaped or formed by the bias of the media that you're consuming? I mean, that's a little scary to think about when you think about it objectively, that your opinions may be totally not your own.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's hard to, the only way to overcome that, though, is to sift through, hundreds of pages of written things, to dig up information, to sit there and ponder and decide on things. And, we just don't have the time to do that. And, we just go with it sometimes. And, we put some trust in media and how these things are presented. We trust that they'll show us the information that we would most be interested in a way that, we would want to see it to understand the consequences of what's going to happen given some information. And, as you said, Dee, we hear it, you listen to CNN and Fox News and the same thing sounds totally different.
Yeah, and you were talking about feeding people information, and it's a wonderful sentiment, but there's also something that's extremely powerful. It's another one of these cognitive biases that affects basically everyone in a very real, powerful way. It's called the backfire effect. We've talked about this on previous episodes, but in a nutshell, it's a tendency to double down on a belief when presented with evidence to the contrary.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me.
Yeah, and that's scary. I mean, we should definitely talk. We're talking about some really good biases, things that people should just know to live. Like, it's a darn shame that they're not taught in school anywhere.
Oh, yeah. But this one in particular is very powerful that Caleb just brought up.
Continue on, Caleb. Sorry.
Well, no, you're fine. I mean, again, as with the other one, the backfire effect is another one of these cognitive biases that's well studied. There have been a lot of peer-reviewed research done on the topic. In one particular study, in Stanford, there was it was rather the Stanford bias interpretation experiment, in which participants with strong opinions about the death penalty were asked to read about mixed experimental evidence. And what they found was 23% of the participants reported that their views had become even more extreme. And this self-reported shift correlated strongly with their initial attitudes. So what they're saying here is that if you walked in there with an extremely passionate view on the death penalty, and they presented you with evidence to the contrary or reasons to think that the death penalty is wrong or whatever, those people tend to become even more fervent in their beliefs. And this is just, case study after case study. This is just proven over and over and over again. You're going to find that a lot of people do this.
This is downright depressing. I mean, that just means that if you give convincing evidence on a particular topic, overwhelming evidence, that most people, because this is the bias that's wired into them, will not listen to your evidence and will double down on their ridiculousness. Now,
the reports here on average state between 20 and 25. I just want to make that clear. 25%, not most people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Still, that's significant, but yes, that's a big difference between most.
Well,
that's more promising. Thank you. You've reinstated some hope. Thank you.
A little bit of faith in humanity has been reinstated.
Well, there's another one there's another bias that's kind of related to the backfire effect. It's called the continued influence effect. This one is a tendency to continue to believe previously learned misinformation, even after it's been corrected. One example that I can give for this is, again, let's just use the same example I used earlier. When I was coming out of my spiritual phase, I would often find much of the air quotes evidence for the supernatural compelling, even though I already had really good explanations to explain all of that. Sometimes I would hear what I thought were footsteps in my house and think, oh, I wonder if that's Chuck. So again, this one in particular, again, it's called the continued influence effect. And it's, it's where misinformation can still influence and generate incorrect. I'm sorry, I'm just going to stop talking. That sentence is bombing itself.
I got a good question for you based on that particular and a lot of these biases we've been talking about. How long did it take you guys to change your opinion a total 180 degrees on a topic that you can remember? Like, was it sudden? Like, did you just have a paradigm shift, or did something build up to a paradigm shift, or was it just a slow process over time, or all of the above?
For me, I think I was convinced internal. Like, I think if I'd have asked myself, which I did often actually, when I asked myself, to myself, do I really believe in any of this? Do I believe in any of it at all? I think I would have said no. But there was one day in particular for me where I was sitting in the living room with my wife, and we had a moment of silence. And for some reason, I just felt like blurting it out. I said, Heather, I don't think I could ever believe in Christianity. And she was like, okay, that's fine. I'm not really Christian either. You should know that. I was like, okay, well, I also don't think that I could ever believe in a God again. Not unless somebody provides me with something tangible that says in some direct way that it's even plausible that a God exists. She's like, really? Well, so we had our talk at that point. But that moment for me was the first time, I think, where it became real for me. I don't know why. I just felt the reason to blurt that out like that.
No, it's interesting.
With me, it takes a while. You know, I'm very methodical in how I do things usually, but even with things that I'm not, you know, for example, when I was growing up, you know, I was around people that weren't exactly gay people friendly. You know, I was listening to this rap band that kept talking about how they're going to beat up the gay people and all this kind of stuff, you know, stuff that I today consider totally disgusting, right? But what eventually changed my mind really was evidence. I was working with a guy that happened to be gay, but I didn't know for a while. And for a long while, I didn't know. And I found out that he's actually just a regular guy, just going about his business. He was nice to hang out with, you know, all that type of stuff. And, you know, once I found out, I had a little bit of that backfire effect. But then, you know, as the days went on and I, you know, kept thinking about it and I kept observing things, you know, slowly but surely, like all these barriers one by one, you know, started coming down. And, you know, I finally came to the conclusion that no, you know, being gay is just fine and these people are fine. And, you know, I'm totally good with that. But, you know, it takes a long time for me, at least. It's not a sudden thing. And, you know, sometimes I tend to have a little bit of that, you know, backfire effect that's there. That's there.
It's interesting. It's been, for me, it's been, I can think of several like really big, you know, paradigm shifts, which is basically like busting open a bias, a big one, where like the whole world just rearranged for me at those times. Now I'm way further down the path now, and those big ones don't happen anymore like they used to. But I love looking at these littler biases and just blowing holes in them in my mind, as far as like biases that I have, and they're really not a good way to think, or realizing what they are and try to enjoy the biases that are good, but get rid of the ones that are bad. But it's been just a long, slow journey for me on the biases, and I just enjoy kind of learning them one by one and doing these types of conversations. But the really big ones in the past have revolved mainly around lots of information. And then it culminated in almost like into a bursting of the dam, and then everything would change after that.
Well,
let me throw a bias out there for us. Oh, Caleb, go ahead if you wanted to say something. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I think that we've beaten that horse.
Okay. Let's move on to another one that I think is very interesting. It's called the status quo bias. So this is a bias where people tend to make decisions that maintain the way things are, you know, the status quo. You know, to me, that stems a little bit from the fact that we may be afraid of change to an extent, even if we don't realize it. You know, we tend to make choices that keep things the same. You know, for example, old people, they don't like computers. You know, you've heard from your grandfather, well, you know, why should I buy a computer? You know, I've always done it this way. You know, I've always gone to Sears to buy my tools. You know, why should I buy them on Amazon, you know, or whatever it may be? You know, I read the newspaper. Why should I read it online on CNN.com? You know, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
So,
I mean, this is the only thing that's preventing me from moving to Texas, in all honesty. Heather and I talk about it all the time, about the option, the possibility of doing it, because I have it. I mean, at any point, I could, within a couple of months, be living in Texas and have the same job. We both really want to go, but we just don't really want to hit that reset button. We want to keep things the way they are. We like where we are, but at the same time, we also at some point think that we do want to do it, but it's really difficult.
Yeah, it affects life in many, many interesting ways. This is one example you gave, but let me throw one that I guarantee you few people have heard of or have thought about. For example, there have been studies. For example, when you go get your driver's license, right? You on the form there, you can check a box saying I want to be an organ donor or not. If that box is basically pre-selected for you, or if the question is do you want to opt out of being an organ donor, most people would be organ donors. If the question is do you want to become an organ donor, most people won't become an organ donor. So this is an example of, well, things are the way they are and I'm going to keep them the way they are.
A lot of these biases just seem to point to the fact that humans are lazy. We're really lazy in the head.
Well, that's actually one of the things that helps us become where we. I'm sorry, that's one of the things that's actually gotten us to where we are. I actually want to point that out because I actually think it's a somewhat important point. Off topic, admittedly, so I'll keep it extremely brief. The capacity to have these mental shortcuts is what's known as a heuristic. Heuristics are like rules of thumb. They're ways of our brain quickly making a decision without us having to consciously think about it. And so there are evolutionary reasons to have them. And things like boredom as well. Boredom is one of those things that provokes us to go out there and learn something. When you're bored, it's because you're either not entertained or you're not learning anything. And so if you're bored, you're going to actively go out there and do one of those two things, and it's better than sitting around doing nothing. So it's one of these heuristics, I presume on a genetic level, that allow us to actually be as aware of reality in the way that we are, as we are. We're the only species on the planet that can look up and think, I wonder if I am the universe thinking about itself.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
But I'm sorry, that was a big tangent, but I felt for some reason it needed to be said.
Off the tangent. I totally forgot the bias we were talking about now. Sorry.
Well, status quo bias. That was a status quo bias.
Yeah, and your status quo bias sounds very similar to the framing effect bias. Because you were saying
a lot of those are related. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure I wasn't the only one that caught that.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
basically, it's if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's kind of the status quo bias.
I got a question for you. It's not off topic, but it's not talking about specific biases.
Okay.
What part of us is not bias?
Well, what do you mean by us, though? Because then now you're delving into questions of consciousness.
Yeah, I guess so. I could be a question of consciousness, but I mean, almost everything I do is built on some sort of opinion or cultural norm or something like that. So I mean, isn't it all just a bunch of bias?
Not necessarily. Let me put it this way.
Please talk.
For example, when you're learning something new, for example, you're learning how to add and subtract. You're learning how to ride a bicycle, and this kind of just goes to the way that the brain works a little bit, So at first, you have to pay attention to where you put your hands on the bicycle. How do you brake? Is it the left that's the front brake or the right that's the brake? Or, on a motorcycle, your left is your clutch and your right is your brake. And, your right pedal is the rear brake and your left pedal up and down is your gear shift. You're paying attention to all these different things and you're constantly thinking about it as you're learning how to ride a bicycle, motorcycle, do this or that. But then all that stuff becomes internalized, right? So your brain starts to do that on autopilot without you ever thinking about it,
Yeah, like walking into a dark room and flipping the switch.
Yeah. Once you've been riding a motorcycle for 10 years, you never have to think about, when you're braking to hold the clutch so your engine doesn't die, or when you're used to riding a stick shift in your car, you got to hit the clutch before you stop or your engine is going to die, right? So, there's this automation that happens in our brain, and to a large extent, it's been necessary because we can't just sit there and think about everything that we have to do all the time, or constantly evaluate all of the information that's coming at us without these shortcuts. I mean, we'd be sitting there thinking about what color shoes to buy for hours. If you have to consider every outfit that you can potentially have in your closet and all this. So use these shortcuts. It's either brown or black shoes. Okay, well, I have 3 blacks, so maybe I'll buy a brown. Like, these are shortcuts that we use. And that's what these biases are at the end of the day, in my opinion, is just shortcuts for how to get to through the day faster, and in the most efficient possible way.
I think bias just has a negative connotation to it, whether it's for me specifically, like I've given it a negative connotation. But I mean, what would you guys say that the term bias has a negative connotation attached to it?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
it doesn't really
has it. Yeah.
It doesn't deserve it. I mean,
not
there's
always,
definitely,
for sure. Yeah.
Not always. There's some biases that are very good, and then some that are very bad. We tend to talk about the bad ones and all the time, but we don't really talk about what's good about biases. And I think it's a good point to make. I think that a lot of our personality outside of skills and that sort of stuff are our biases, the things that we like, our food, the colors we like, the people we like. And those are good things that make us who we are.
Well,
sure.
And go ahead.
Yeah, well, in essentially, a bias, again, is just your own subjective bubble of reality, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your bubble of reality isn't objectively true, at least parts of it. So, like, for example, my materialism, I would think that, although I can't prove it to myself, to 100% certainty, because there's always a chance of hearts out, blah, blah, blah. But, oh crap! I lost my train of thought there. I'm sorry.
Well, let me jump in and fill in a little bit. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's kind of related. But I guess it could be a bias. We tend to forget the bad times and remember the good times, and that makes our life happier. If we constantly pondered all of the bad things that have happened to us, along with all the good things, we'd live a lot more miserable lives, I think. You forget the pain of breaking your leg. You forget, just various different things when people have wronged you a long time ago. And it helps us. So no, I would say that biases are not always a bad thing. In fact, in many cases, they're a good thing. But we should recognize that we have them. And, for those that are affecting us in a negative way, we should try at least to recognize they're there and see if we're not relying on one of those biases to reach a decision, as opposed to doing the rational decision.
I agree. I would say that the negative biases some of the negative biases have a very, very negative effect. So much so that they pretty much demand our attention.
There's something actually called the negativity bias. And it's the fact that people tend to pay more attention to negative news. We have this selective attention. Even though, for example, crime, murder, all that stuff has decreased dramatically over the decades, with the exception of maybe like Chicago or some of those places where crimes may have gone up, or certain districts in Chicago or neighborhoods or other cities. But as a general rule, we're a lot safer today. But because of how horrible some bad news are, when you hear, some gunman went into a school and killed 20 kids, this thing is so awful. And, and we tend to pay a lot more attention to that than the news that maybe some doctor invented a new procedure that's going to save thousands of lives. We just kind of glance over that. We almost expect that that's going to happen, and we focus on these negative things
Well, sure. I mean, but again, put a positive spin on this. These are the sort of things that help us learn from our past. We wouldn't really be able to correct our errors if we wouldn't remember them because they seem insignificant or the exact same as everything else. You need to be able to identify and remember that to learn from it. But also, excuse me, man.
That's two, man.
I know. Hold on. This is gonna kill me. I had a thought. It was a. Oh, okay. So here we go. Most people. Okay, I'm gonna start up. So most people actually have a sort of masochistic tendencies. Have masochistic tendencies to some degree on a continuum of masochism. Like for example, a lot of people like really hot sauce, right? That's a sort of that pain sense of pleasure response, and some people like watching really graphic horror movies.
Piercing yourself.
Yeah, piercing yourself. That's a really good one. Tattoos. These sorts of things. And so it can. These biases. This one in particular, negativity bias, I don't necessarily think is neither good or bad, because it can lead to learning from your mistakes, but at the same time, this is really derived from the fact that I think this is a heuristic, is what I'm saying. Because I think it's derived from the fact that we tend to have masochistic tendencies. And so I think that, well, anyway, at the very least, I think that those tendencies tend to fuel the bias fire.
Well, I think, too, it's the negative things that affect us the most and have the biggest impact on us. So, thinking about the possibility of a tornado whipping through or some dramatic event that's not very likely, but when it does happen, I think a good example would be like if you're an animal in the jungle, it's best to be paranoid.
Yeah.
Because when you're paranoid,
related, definitely,
yeah, if you jump every time there's a noise or a breaking of a stick, well, then you're guaranteed to be safe, even though maybe only 1 out of 1,000 times it's an actual predator sneaking up on you. But it's the ones that are paranoid that have the evolutionary advantage to live longer. So I guess that's how I kind of see that negativity effect.
Yeah, but again, to put, I honestly don't think that these. I kind of want to emphasize in our last couple of minutes here that these biases, again, there's not necessarily a negative connotation to these, because birds, for example, would not have the sheer numbers that they have today in the United States if it was, well, certain types of birds, if it wasn't for human intervention. Like there are swarms of seagulls and such, for example, that humans will feed, so they're more docile. These animals don't have that let's flinch every time 100% of the time mentality. And these are the ones that get the food. So, over time you get this effect. And dogs, there's a perfect example. The ones that ignored that response, that bias, they were the ones that eventually became dogs.
Yeah, the negativity bias can have positive effects. It's what allows us to keep driving crime down, by keeping the focus on it. By keeping the focus on other negative things in our life, we spend time fixing those things instead of ignoring them.
Can you? Oh, sorry.
That was it.
Can you guys think of a bias that has no positive spin to it? Some evolutionary advantage, like some bias that's just a flaw in us. Or
confirmation bias.
Yeah, I was thinking confirmation bias too. I can't see what the heck it serves in any environment.
Yeah, I agree. I think that if we would tend to doubt our first bit of information and doubt things that should be in line with our personal beliefs first, that we'd be far ahead of where we are today as a species.
I agree. V, do you have any opinion on that?
No, I mean confirmation bias.
We should talk about
it's hard to put a
bias,
positive. It's hard to put a positive spin on it, because all it means is that you've already made up your mind and you're not going to change it based on new information.
we should talk about what confirmation bias is to our audience, and I think we should spend some time on it too, because for me, it was one of the more powerful biases to learn. Like, once I understood what confirmation bias was and how I was using it, it was very powerful. It had a very powerful impact on me, changed my life. So
it's very powerful today.
What does anybody feel like they have a decent?
Yeah, with the digital world that we live in today, confirmation bias is huge.
Huge. Okay, give me a definition of confirmation bias. Somebody got a good one?
Well, confirmation bias is basically seeking out information that already confirms what you believe and discarding information that tends to disprove what you believe.
I would just want to add a little bit here, a tidbit, that it's also the tendency to agree with information that already comports to your worldview.
Yeah, they tend to value that information more highly and tend to perceive it as more likely to be true.
So this is a bias built into us, and I would hesitate to say it's a cultural bias. I would say it's more genetic. Would you guys agree with me on that?
Yes,
like it's just the human condition?
Well, I don't know. I take that back. I'm going to remain agnostic on this one, but I'm actually kind of leaning more towards it is a cultural trait, because this is something that you can learn to overcome, albeit I don't think, well, you know what? You're right. Maybe, okay. Again, I'm agnostic on this.
Sure,
okay, hold on.
Well, let me throw this out there. The confirmation bias today is exacerbated. For example, I get a lot of my news on Yahoo, and Yahoo learns the kind of news that you want to see and shows you more of those type of news. And it's the same thing with social media, like Facebook, like Twitter, like all these things. For example, on Twitter, you go and you choose who you want to follow, so all that you see is the people you want to follow, and those people are likely to agree with you. I mean, if you're a super left-leaning person, you're not going to go on Twitter and follow Rush Limbaugh. And if you're a very conservative person, you're not going to go on YouTube and watch Keith Olbermann or subscribe to follow what's that lady on MSNBC? I can't think of her name right now.
Linda Kelly. But I don't know. Is that right?
No, it was another one. She's a late night host. Anyways, but that's the confirmation bias, and it's exacerbated by media today, because it tends to serve us the news that we already want to see, and it tends to show us the opinion that we already agree with. And it's way too easy to ignore other opinions.
Well, I think
politics is huge.
Yeah.
The thing is it is literally everywhere. Confirmation bias. I'm gonna go ahead and switch my stance to say I think it is a genetic thing. I don't think you could escape it. I don't think there's anything you could do to not have confirmation bias, at least initially, like that impulse to do it.
I can give you a really good example of what taught me about confirmation bias. Trading in the markets, day trading. Boy, if you develop an opinion that you think you know the future, that the market's going to go up or down, all you will look at is information that confirms your bias. And it just, digs it into your soul that you think you're right. And when nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. And that confirmation bias will destroy you as a trader. Absolutely.
Well, I mean,
destroy.
90% of the time, if you invest your money in funds that are not actively managed, you will make more money than if you invest your money in funds that are actively managed by supposed people that know what they're doing. And I would guess that has a lot to do with confirmation bias, because those people, like you said, are finding information that confirms their opinion of where the market is going to go, and they bet that way more often than not.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is you guys are talking a lot about the marketing aspect of this, and essentially like that whole recommended column when you go to YouTube or Netflix. That when you combine that with confirmation bias, you can also get these other effects like anchoring bias. The anchoring bias, for the audience, also sometimes called focalism, is a cognitive bias that describes the common human tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information offered, quote, the anchor, when making decisions. So if your whole bubble, because even Google, when you're searching things, Google tends to track you as an individual, at least your computer. So it'll even create a sort of bubble for you in your space, where you are, your search history, etc. So you're going to find more often than not things that already report, to adhere to your worldview. And if these things are claiming to be truth claims when in fact they're not, then you're likely to be subject to the anchoring bias.
Yeah, anchoring bias is very powerful. It has so many different implications. I mean, for example, you're at a job interview, and who's going to throw out the first number for your salary? Are you supposed to say it, or the boss? And based on whatever that first number is, that's how, you're not going to stray too far from that number. Or in other types of negotiation, when you go look at a used car,
mm-hmm.
the first price that's thrown out tends to have a lot of weight, and you're going to move only a little bit from that initial price, even if the final price ends up still being too expensive. You just can't move too far from that. The negotiations are going to fall apart if you try to stray too far from that initial number.
Yeah. And this is why it's important to try to learn what these biases are, because if you don't, people can actually use them against you as well. And you find this all over the place, especially in marketing. Like, for example, if you go to like a going out of business sale, and they have this big sticker on their refrigerator that says 30% off today.
Right.
They might actually adjust the purchase price to compensate for that 30%, so that the deal that you're getting is horrible. But you just assume that the deal is supposed to be good because it's 30% off. This actually happened to my wife and I. We went out and we went to one of these store closing sales, and we decided to continue shopping. We found the exact same make and model at a different store, not even on sale, for $200 cheaper than the 30% sale that the store closing sale was offering. So again, it's important not to just fall victim to these biases. It's important to learn about them.
Yeah, and it's also true with, for example, restaurant menus. Every once in a while on the menu, you'll see some item that's really expensive, and your attention will focus on that item. And then everything else in comparison to that would seem like a really good deal, even if it's not, even if you can get the same thing somewhere else for cheaper. But, there's this perception of value that gets distorted when you see that first, big number on there, as you're maybe just kind of scanning through the menu. Your eyes are naturally going to focus on like these big or these really small numbers. So depending on, where the anchor kind of sort of falls, it may distort the perceived value of something you're buying.
Would you guys consider that using these types of biases to your advantage in marketing an unethical thing?
Oh, they're absolutely using that.
Well, they actually use stores. Them. We give them a pass. We give stores a pass. We give a lot of people a pass on using this type of stuff to, their advantage in the markets. But it has a tinge of being unethical to it, does it not?
That is all the time we have for you this week. This has been the Hoosier Humanist Hour. Be sure to check out FreeThought Fort Wayne on Facebook and on Meetup.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope your days are filled with logic, reasoning, and the eternal quest for knowledge.
The